Hey, I've got a guest I'm really excited about, Sohrab Ahmari. He is the op-ed editor of the New York Post, and he's also a contributing editor to the Catholic Herald, but he is also the author of From Fire by Water. Really good writer, by the way. He's the author of From Fire by Water, My Journey to the Catholic Faith, which chronicles his journey from an atheist living under a fundamentalist government in Iran to Catholicism. Nearly 2 decades later, it is a really, really interesting story. As you know, I've taken a journey myself, not quite as dramatic, but certainly a dramatic journey to Christianity. Sohrab, thanks so much for coming on. It's great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Let's begin with your childhood or your teenage years. I mean, that is it's an extraordinary way to grow up. Can you give us some sense of what it was like, what you were living under?
Yeah, I was living in a doublethink world, in the sense that my parents were children of 1968. They were bohemian, liberal, hippie types, which existed in Iran as much as they did in Paris or San Francisco. But meanwhile, we found ourselves in a newly re-Islamizing Iran, because I was born 6 years to the day the Ayatollah Khomeini returned from his exile to herald the new Islamic Republic. And so I lived in this world where the inner world, the interior world, I was surrounded by Western books and movies and ideas and parents who told me the only thing that mattered was that I just be, quote unquote, be myself. And an outside world, outside our closed doors, that was, Sharia norms were being reintroduced violently. Men and women couldn't hold hands, you couldn't drink, and so on and so forth. So that interior clash led me to conclude when I was 12 or 13 that there's no God, that religion is all a bunch of public hypocrisy.
Was that what your parents believed? Were your parents atheists?
I don't know what my parents were. I think they were just kind of ecumenical liberals. That was their religion. They even liked bits of Islam that were humanistic. They liked the ancient Persian Zoroastrianism, which is a kind of ancient Persian proto-religion. We had an Armenian nanny, so we went to her Orthodox church. So they didn't, in the way that liberal ecumenical type people can be, all of those views were kind of welcome, but none of them was taken too seriously.
So were you witnessing the return of Sharia? Was this something that you could go out onto the street and see, or was the world around you still a fairly liberal world?
I think my parents tried to shield me as much as possible, but you couldn't escape it, in the sense that, we at school, when we had the Shiite mourning, because Iran, as you know, is majority Shiite, the various Shiite saints who were being mourned, for example, you would do the ceremonies at school, at public school. We were very much aware that alcohol was prohibited. And so that meant was that my parents and their friends liked to drink, but there was always an element of risk that actually was part of the fun, was you could get caught by the morality police. And the fact was, what was most interesting about it is most people think, in Iran, if you're caught with alcohol, you'll get flogged. Chances are that you won't. You can bribe the morality police to overlook your iniquities. On the other hand, you could face someone who's a true believer, the agent, and then you end up with your back looking like challah bread for the rest of your life.
Wow. I like the idea of a morality police that can be bribed. You can't make that stuff up. So when and how do you get out of there?
So at age 13, when I'm about to turn 14, actually, my mother and I left because I had an uncle who'd settled in the U.S. right at the time of the revolution. So when we left in 1998, we got what's called the Family Preference Visa Program, just a green card. So we came over, and I had this idea that America was the Manhattan of the movies, that it'd be very individualistic, very secular, and almost hedonistic in a way that I wanted or sought after. So imagine my surprise, we got on a plane from Tehran to Amsterdam. Then from Amsterdam, we flew over, and as we reached the continental United States, we didn't stop in Manhattan. We landed in this place called Minneapolis. And then we didn't even stop there. We then took another flight to a city called Salt Lake City, which is where my uncle had settled. He was actually north of Salt Lake City in a small town. So I was totally shocked. Obviously, this is not the promised land I'd been promised.
So now you're 14, you said?
Yeah.
And so you're growing up in the Midwest?
in Utah, in the Mountain West, which is
Yeah.
surrounded by Mormon culture in a town of 600 people called Eden, Utah. And what that meant was I almost immediately picked up the revolution that I have launched against all traditional morality, against God, against authority in the old country, and applied it to this new society
Right.
and its kind of foundations.
So
almost seamlessly rebellious.
And all right, so you're still an atheist, and atheism makes perfect sense because all you see is repressive religion, both there and here. So where do you go when you leave home? What's the next step?
So I went to University of Washington. I started at Utah State just because they gave us a scholarship, but then I transferred out. And I transferred out because by then I had become a Marxist. I took very seriously. I read Nietzsche first in high school, and then I read Marx. If there's no God, then man, in a sense, is abolished as and we could create a society that's based on totally new values. All values being the product of history and power dynamics. There's nothing inherently good or evil. So I became a Marxist in a very serious sense, and so I transferred to that school because the headquarters of the Trotskyite group, of which I was a member, was in Seattle, which, as you know, was then and is now a hotbed of sort of American hard leftism. So yeah, that was my first trip out of Utah. I guess
it's very hard to get over Nietzsche. He's like a very powerful writer and a very I think he's very insightful and honest about his conclusions. I mean, he doesn't shy away from his own conclusions. He's tough to get around.
He is, and he's very powerful to read, especially if you're young and you haven't read what comes before. All the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition and in Athens and Jerusalem, if you will. If you don't have a grounding in that, then Nietzsche can totally overpower you, and convince you values, and not least Judeo-Christian values are the product of a slave-like people,
right?
Because they didn't have, because they themselves weren't virile, they treated virility as something sinful.
Yeah.
Because they themselves didn't have a dominating urge, they thought that strength was a bad thing, and so on and so forth. So, and that made sense as in my late teens, early 20s. Yeah.
So now, I mean, you have become a prominent journalist, obviously. You come into a world when you come into the world of sophisticated writers, sophisticated thinkers, atheism is kind of. I found you're younger than I was, but I found that atheism was kind of the default position. Did you find that as well?
Yes. I mean, even I'm lucky. I work at my whole professional career has been mostly in News Corp, in conservative editorial pages, first the Wall Street Journal and now the New York Post. And I have lots of colleagues who are people of faith, mainly Catholics and Jews. But on the whole, the wider journalistic ecosystem is atheistic, or at most it wants to relegate faith to a narrow private sphere. Say, oh, okay, you believe this crazy stuff, your subjective views, it can't have an objective say in the public square, surely. And I think that's the attitude that not my immediate colleagues, but the wider profession shares. I think maybe that you agree. I don't know.
So let me. How did you make the transition? Obviously, if you're working for News Corp, you probably made a transition away from Marxism. How do you make the transition away from Marxist atheism to Catholicism? And is the political journey and the religious journey linked?
They are. In fact, I initially just became a secular conservative. I mean, I had a series of experiences, most important of which was after college, I didn't have anything to do. So I joined this organization, Teach for America,
sure,
which places recent college graduates in needy classrooms. And that turned my worldview upside down in the sense that as a Marxist, I was just told and had concluded that the reason inequalities persist in the achievement gap between poor students and their affluent peers is merely because of redistributive justice. That there isn't if you could just have more money in poor schools, children of the poor would do just as well. But then when I actually went to become a teacher, I saw that that there is this that even in the most dire classrooms, good teachers can make a huge difference. And the old moralistic notions that I used to sneer at about hard work and discipline could go a long way. And so, Marxist materialism says people are who they are and believe what they believe because of their economic circumstances. And my experience in Teach for America turned that right upside down, that your values, your character, virtue can determine the order of material things.
Yeah.
So that made me a kind of secular. It didn't make me a believer. And then I read proper history, having not read it in college, but I then read it on my own. A history of the 20th century, Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, Natan Sharansky's Fear No Evil, all these books that convinced me that, no, the God of the Bible is a liberator. The God of the Bible is not an oppressive God. In fact, he's a bulwark against totalitarianism because of the human dignity that he imbues in the human person. That all the things that I appreciated now in this new society that I found myself in, once I got over my sort of adolescent sneering at it, I realized the very best things about it have Judeo-Christian roots. So then that didn't necessarily make me a believer yet, but it was pushing me along to say, well, how is it that the society rooted in the idea that God made man in his own image is a democracy? And I used to brag about my atheism, but by the time I was 23, 24, I would say, look, I'm not fortunate enough to be a person of faith, but I appreciate that other people are.
Uh-huh. Okay. So now this thing, especially in a world of science, especially in a world where virtually every science book I read has an advertisement for atheism in it for some reason. How do you get around that to actual faith?
Well, my coming to faith was through the proof for the existence of God through the conscience, which is also the one that C.S. Lewis uses, I guess, in Mere Christianity. I read Lewis much later, but I had trouble accounting for the presence of this inner voice inside me that already knew what was wrong in a sense and what was right. In other words, there is an objective morality that is sort of deeply embedded in the human person, so that even when two school children have an argument over, one of them takes the other one's orange, the one whose orange has been taken away says, hey, that's not fair. And they both understand that, which means and they both have an objective sense of what fairness is. This ideal is in their souls. So that was helpful to me, thinking about my own conscience, what it was telling me. And then I read Pope Benedict's books, especially Jesus of Nazareth, which he wrote after he was
a great book,
elected. And first of all, if you think you're kind of an intellectual and you're too smart for God, then you come face to face with a thinker like Benedict, and you're like, okay, you can be intelligent and believe. And that there are a set of questions that are posed by the fear of death, questions that are posed by the fear of God, by issues of right and wrong, to which no amount of technological modernity is the answer. Gives the answer. The scientific advancement, technological advancements can answer the how questions. We have a conscience because as evolutionary beings, blah, 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 we develop, or so on and so forth, but it can't answer the why questions.
Right.
And I found the most cogent answers to those why questions in the Bible itself, in sacred scripture, and ultimately in the teaching of the Catholic Church.
I'm out of time. I wish I could talk to you for a lot longer, because I just find this a fascinating journey. Let me ask you if you can tell me quickly, since being baptized, since becoming a Catholic, what are the changes you've noticed in your actual life?
I had a lot more guilt.
that's always a positive, right?
It's good guilt, yeah.
Yeah,
it's how
you see the world more honestly, I think.
No, but also more seriously, as a journalist, Christianity is about grace, but it's also about moral order. And as a journalist, I now have a sense of what order and disorder are, in a way that is not haphazard but systematic. And so I go out into the world as a journalist with a confidence that that I didn't have. I suppose. Yeah.
Sohrab Ahmari, author of From Fire by Water, My Journey to the Catholic Faith. Thanks. I hope you'll come back and talk about some secular matters like Iran and other things that you've been writing about. I would love to talk to you again.
Happily. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure.